Hello everyone, my name is Kaylee Riggs and I'm going to be talking to you today about eugenics. Specifically, what it is, its history, and the current controversy surrounding eugenics. Eugenics started gaining fame around 1869, but it has been a concept since the ancient Greeks. The term eugenics was coined by a man named Francis Galton, an English scientist. He based it off the Greek word eugenes, which meant well-born or hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. Galton also developed the two methods used in eugenics, the positive eugenics and negative eugenics. He based his work off of studying European families and believed that the genius, our ability to succeed in life, was a trait that was passed on through each generation. With Galton's work and the genetic studies done by the Austrian botanist Gregor Mendel, scientists and social reformers sought a way to improve the human population by controlling heredity. During the Progressive Era, eugenics had widespread popularity across the United States. So what is eugenics exactly? It is the idea that society can be improved by erasing disease, particularly genetic diseases, mental illness, and the poor and immoral. There are two main divisions of eugenics: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is focused on encouraging certain members of society to procreate with one another. They may have desirable traits such as intelligence, athleticism, or what they perceive as good morals. It could also be that they do not carry any genetic diseases or do not have a history of mental illness. Positive eugenics methods includes education, tax incentives, and childbirth stipends. While those seen as fit by society were educated on why they should procreate, the unfit were also educated as to why their offspring would be harmful to society. Negative eugenics reduces or eliminates the procreation of what society considers the unfit, which will look very similar and sometimes a little different in different examples that I'll be presenting today. Negative eugenics uses methods such as marriage restrictions, immigration restrictions, segregation, sexual sterilization, and euthanasia. There are even extreme cases of complete genocide of a particular group of people. So the US was one of the first nations to put the idea of eugenics into practice. You will see in the picture a fitter family competition. Communities came together to compete over who was the most athletic, the most intelligent, or the strongest. These took place all over the country. But eugenics began well before these competitions. Beginning in 1855, Kansas began performing orchidectomies, which is the surgical removal of one or both testicles, and they performed these on sex offenders or pedophiles, and sometimes even homosexuals were forced to be castrated as well. Other nations later passed legislation to also start castrating criminals and homosexuals. Although most nations outlawed castration and sterilization of criminals after the discovery of Nazi experimentation involving castration. Still to this day, 8 states still allow orchidectomies to be performed on sex offenders, although it is by no means a definite way of preventing recidivism or a criminal's tendency to recommit the same crime. Into the 20th century, 32 sterilization laws were passed in the US to combat degeneracy, and California is probably one of the most notorious for its excessive use of forced sterilizations. Approximately 20,000 people were sterilized. And in 1926, one woman was forcefully sterilized because she had a low IQ of 56. She was sterilized because of a law passed in 1908 that authorized the state to sterilize anyone with a mental illness that was inherited or could be transmitted to descendants. Recent research conducted by Nicole Novak and others went through historical records that indicated Latino men and women were disproportionately affected the most by these sterilization laws. Latino men were 23% more likely, and Latino women were 59% more likely to be sterilized versus non-Latino men and women. And as of 2017, there's been a big push by human rights activists calling on the state of California to give reparations to the remaining survivors of the forced sterilizations, and some individuals have received $20,000 from the state government to compensate for the unconstitutional practice or procedures. And while there are multiple examples of eugenics in the U.S., there's something more current that happened just this past summer in July. The New York Planned Parenthood Clinic removed Margaret Sanger's name from the clinic. While it's been known for years now, Margaret Sanger was a supporter of the eugenics movement and had written racist and controversial ideas in her autobiography about controlling the African American population. She had even consulted the Ku Klux Klan and tried to gain the support of religious or spiritual leaders, and there's been a recent movement of removing what are considered racist figures from different monuments or schools or whatever else. Margaret Sanger was one of the historical figures removed due to her involvement with eugenics. After the establishment of the first family planning clinics, there was a huge case in the state of Virginia in 1927. A hearing was needed to determine Carrie Buck, who was institutionalized for being a feeble-minded woman, and if she was going to be sexually sterilized or not. And the condition had been present in 3 generations of her family. And the court ruled in favor of the sterilization and said it did not violate the Constitution. And in fact, the justice on the case stated that the sterilization law of Virginia was helpful in preventing the nation from, and I quote, being swamped with incompetence. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And it's truly amazing to see how differently our generations view mental health compared to the people in the early 20th century. Okay, moving across the Pacific Ocean, China was and still is utilizing eugenic methods. The Republic of China has passed many controversial laws, and one of those laws included the requirement of premarital medical examinations, or PME. According to a study back in 1998, PME was heavily supported by several scientists. In the study, an ethics survey was completed by 255 geneticists, about 50-50 male-female ratio, that worked in different areas, such as the Chinese Association of Medical Genetics and the Chinese Society of Family Planning. Over 90% of the geneticists agreed that disease carriers should not procreate with one another. And over 80% agreed that government should require PMEs and genetic tests for couples. An overwhelming majority also agreed that genetic testing should be included in pre-employment medical examination. However, one of the ethics issues that the geneticists were divided on was if women's abortion decision should be their own, with about 40% saying that they agreed and 40% saying they did not agree, and the remaining 20% being undecided. So in order for a couple to get married, they were both required to have strict and invasive medical examinations and sometimes genetic screening to determine if they can be allowed to marry and procreate. And this was part of the article of the Maternal and Infant Health Care Law. Another article within the law, they stated that they could still get married as long as they decided to agree to sterilization or use long-term contraceptive methods. And the purpose of this was to avoid potentially producing children that may have mental illness, disease, or anything else that the Chinese society would have considered unfit. And even abortions were encouraged under this law in the case of the fetus having a serious disease or deformity that would prevent them from totally or partially living independently. Although PME became voluntary in 2003, many couples still decide to participate due to China's family planning policy. The family planning policy began with a one-child policy. With some rare exceptions, married couples were only allowed to have one child. The goal was to slow population growth and focus on having healthier births. If couples conceived another child, the mother would have to have a drug-induced abortion. It was not until recently, in 2015, that couples are now allowed to have 2 children, as long as at least one parent came from a single child home. So, just to the east of China, Japan also had some eugenics laws. The first one being the Leprosy Prevention Law of 1907, 1931, and 1953. Lepers were segregated and even sterilized by force. The National Eugenic Law of 1940 forced sterilization of criminals, those with inheritable mental illness, and other genetic diseases such as colorblindness, hemophilia, ichthyosis, and epilepsy. Just in the first year the law was passed, 94 forced sterilizations occurred. 8 years later, another major law passed, the Eugenic Protection Law of 1948, or EPL. Its intentions were to prevent births of inferior offspring and to protect women as well. The image shows what they considered inferior children. In the image, you can see them participating in exercises, trying to give them more mobile. It is likely that some of these children, if not all, were sterilized for their physical abnormalities. EPL allowed for the formation of local committees that would determine if a pregnancy could continue or if it needed to be terminated, and if the woman needed to be sterilized as well. Reasons for termination included mental or physical handicaps, genetic disease, and genetic predisposition to commit crimes. I don't know how they would be able to determine that unless it was a parent that was also a criminal, but that was another reason for terminating pregnancy. An article was added to the law of 1952 that allowed physicians to apply for sterilization of a person with psychosis or a mental deficiency that was not even hereditary, as long as the parent or guardian consented to the procedure. And it was not until 1996 that EPL was repealed, and now only voluntary sterilizations and abortions can occur. So now on to the subject that I'm sure most of you were anticipating, eugenics in Nazi Germany. In 1930, the Nazi party gained most of its power and control over the government, and one aspect of the Nazi ideology was the eugenic idea of racial hygiene. And racial hygiene was an idea that came from the theory of social Darwinism. People belonging to the Nazi party believed that providing medical care to the weak or unfit was going against nature's natural selection, and more of the unfit they were seeing were multiplying faster than the young and able body. And at first, racial hygienists suggested a more positive eugenics approach by promoting the procreation of the fit population. However, it progressed towards more negative eugenic methods. The image is actually Nazi propaganda that explained the importance of preventing births of the unfit. The translation is, "You are sharing the load. A hereditarily ill person costs 50,000 Reichsmarks, on average up to the age of 60. The Nazi party was pushing for complete elimination of the degenerate genes from the German race. It began with controlled reproduction of the mentally ill and physically deformed and sexual degenerates. It eventually turned into euthanizing the unfit people, which the Nazi party considered mercy killings. The euthanasia program began with newborn babies to children up to the age of 4. The children were euthanized by starvation, exposure, or the administration of cyanide, chemical warfare agents, and even poison. The Jewish people also were targeted by eugenic laws. Jews were not only hated by Germans, they were actually discriminated against in most of Europe. And so the Nuremberg laws of 1935 called for the sterilization of degenerates and prevented interracial marriages between Jews and non-Jews. The goal was to have complete emigration of the Jews, but by 1941, the party was attempting to eliminate the Jewish people altogether. It is well known that the Jews were taken to concentration camps where many were forced to work, and some were even executed or died from starvation, disease, or exposure. However, at the extermination camps, which came a little later, huge groups of Jews and criminals were murdered together in gas chambers. The chemical agent used to kill the masses of people in these chambers was called Zyklon B. It's a cyanide-based pesticide. While there has been other examples in history of mass genocide, the Holocaust is probably one of the most infamous examples of genocide based on eugenic ideals. Okay. So how does eugenics look in the present day? With the history of eugenics in the US, one may wonder how people feel about it today. Well, a study in 2012 compared opinions of European Americans and Chinese Americans on eugenic ideas. The 4 eugenic attitudes discussed with random adults through phone interviews were they should not have children if there is a 1 in 4 chance of birth defects, mandatory premarital genetic screening, the importance of knowing a spouse's family history of mental illness, and the importance of genetics in serious mental illness. The results supported that researchers' hypothesis that Chinese Americans are significantly more likely to endorse eugenic policies than European Americans. So moving on, there's a very common eugenic practice done in the United States currently, prenatal diagnosis and selective abortion. There are many pregnant mothers out there that are at risk of giving birth to babies with congenital diseases, and some mothers may feel unequipped to care for the child with the severe genetic disorder, and some may not want the child to have to live or suffer with their disease. While some may be completely opposed to abortion for any reason due to religion or what have you, to the rest of the American society, abortion is morally acceptable. However, this practice fits the exact definition of eugenics. Selective abortion improves human lives and decreases genetic disease by controlling who is and who is not born. IVF, or in vitro fertilization, is another common ethically acceptable practice of eugenics. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGT, or PGD, involve the testing of embryos produced through IVF. The embryos can be screened for genetic disease, and if they are positive, they can be discarded or frozen indefinitely. However, there are some people, maybe for religious reasons, that refuse PGT to be done because they do not want the embryos to be destroyed, and they want to give each embryo a chance at life regardless of disease status. Another aspect of PGD that may be concern to people ethically is if people begin to select embryos based on desired traits like intelligence, beauty, athleticism, etc. So I then looked at other nations to see if they still had supporters of eugenics, or at least some of its ideas. In New Zealand, there was a study conducted by Wardell and others to determine the New Zealand media portrayal of Down syndrome. With genetic screening becoming a more routinized part of prenatal checkups, there was a growing concern with certain people and a particular activist group, Saving Downs, that with the increase in genetics screening, there would also be an increase in abortions for fetuses with developmental disabilities like Down syndrome. The researchers went through 140 relevant TV, magazine, and news articles related to genetic screening, Down syndrome, and abortion to determine the tone of the media in regard to their topic. They found a relatively balanced portrayal of living with and caring for people with Down syndrome, and there was almost no mention of abortion used in context specifically with Down syndrome. Wardell and others mentioned how the media is much more positive on the topic of Down syndrome than places like Iceland, where almost every pregnancy that receives a positive test result for Down syndrome was terminated. Therefore, they concluded that there is no evidence in context of the public media that there is any eugenic thinking or attitudes towards people with Down syndrome. With growing knowledge of genetics and new technologies that are being developed, scientists know a lot more about genetic disease. With those suffering with genetic diseases, they may receive genetic counseling, which provides patients with information about reproductive risks related to genetic diseases and help them understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and social implication of living with that disease. So the image on the right shows some of the topics they may discuss in counseling sessions. So you can see motive and risk of inheritance, psychological aspects, family communication, things like that. There are two approaches to genetic counseling, non-directive and directive. Non-directive counseling gives patients information about the disease in the most impartial form possible, so that patients can make their own decisions based on the information provided to them. They can make the decisions on their own reproduction. It gives full autonomy to the patient, which is really important. Compared to directive counseling, a counselor offers their own perceptions and advises the patient on how to proceed living with the genetic disease or condition, and about procreating and the risks involved with that. There's been a concern about the genetic counseling being a form of eugenics because of the effect it has on patients' reproductive decisions, specifically with the directive counseling. Burnell and others decided to research if genetic counseling is simply another form of eugenics through methods of education. They conducted a literature search with terms like bioethics, medical genetics, genetic counseling, and eugenics, and came up with 59 articles that fit the criteria they were looking for. They divided the articles into 3 scenarios: preconception, pre-implantation, and prenatal counseling. In each scenario, they found that in each example of directive counseling, there was evidence of negative eugenics through education. This means that patients were educated about the risk of genetic disease by reproducing or by continuing a pregnancy, and they were advised on how they should proceed, which could cause a little bit of bias. Sometimes the advice was not to reproduce or to even terminate a pregnancy. This fits the simple definition of eugenics. Alright, so throughout this presentation so far, you've probably made the opinion that eugenics equals bad. However, some would argue the opposite and present you with a new liberal eugenics. This new eugenics allows individuals to choose whether or not to use genetic technologies to improve themselves or their offspring, like with IVF or PGD. Human enhancement is one focus of new eugenics. Enhancement involves the prevention of severe genetic disorders. While this sounds like a really great idea, some scientists are struggling with the ethics of altering genes. Genetic engineering is a method currently being researched and developed that involves manipulating an organism's genes using biotechnology. A huge focus on genetic engineering is how scientists can use biotechnology to eliminate genetic diseases in adults suffering with the disease and preventing future generations from developing genetic diseases as well. Also, another possibility with genetic engineering is the creation of designer babies. While some may consider PGD and embryo selection a way to get the perfect baby, sometimes some scientists are intrigued by the idea that genetic engineering can be used to directly change an embryo's DNA so parents can get the exact baby that they want with the physical characteristics or the traits desired. Like they want a baby with blonde or brown hair, certain color of eyes, maybe they want them to be athletic or artistic or something of that nature. So if parents want a tall, intelligent, athletic baby, then with the right amount of money, it may be possible in the future that they can get exactly what they want. The creation of superhumans is also a similar idea to designer babies. The question is, could genetic engineering go beyond the limitations of the human species and make people that are genetically faster, smarter, and stronger than what even the best of the best can do now? Only time will tell. However, there are a few major concerns with this idea. Genetic engineering could seriously decrease genetic diversity. There could be unexpected, disastrous results with manipulating genes. Genetics is still a relatively new science that needs further understanding before we begin altering human DNA. So, I wanted to conclude with a summary of the advantages and disadvantages of eugenics. Advantages include genetic engineering, removal of genetic diseases, and an overall stronger and healthier population. With the technology that is being developed, we may see more of these things in our future. Some disadvantages of eugenics are that it may be morally or ethically questionable depending on the goals of the methods used. There's a risk for losing genetic diversity in the human species, and human enhancement or genetic engineering may be too expensive for everyone to have an equal opportunity of utilizing it. So now, armed with the information I have presented, you can do your own research and formulate your own opinion about the use of eugenics today. So thank you kindly for listening.